Eleanor Roosevelt grew up, and always was, very shy, very reserved, didn't feel comfortable in her own skin as a kid. Here's Eleanor Roosevelt growing up in a family that seemed to, according to her version of it, have every beautiful woman on the planet. She was related to them by blood, and yet she's kind of the ugly duckling.
Like her husband, Eleanor Roosevelt overcame the greatest obstacles life threw at her. By force of will, she transformed a timid young girl into the most influential woman in the world.
Her shyness could have crippled her completely, just as his literally being crippled could have stopped his political career completely. And she's going to tell him, this can't stop you. This cannot stop us.
Franklin Roosevelt taught the world that the only thing to fear is fear itself.
Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
It's a lesson his wife Eleanor learned at an early age. As a young girl, she was awkward and self-conscious, overshadowed by her famous family. Her mother was a Livingston, descended from Scottish nobility. Her father's brother was Teddy Roosevelt, future President of the United States. But Eleanor was determined to face down her fears. At age 20, she plunged into the unknown, marrying her fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
When she married Franklin Roosevelt, she became Eleanor Roosevelt Roosevelt. And so she got politics from both sides. And she understood from a fairly early age that she was smart and she had something to contribute, but she didn't know quite how to contribute.
Eleanor soon found herself under the thumb of Franklin's controlling mother, Sarah. When the newlyweds moved to New York City, Sarah bought adjoining townhouses. One for them, one for her. Already the odd woman out, Eleanor discovered that Franklin was unfaithful.
There was a family crisis. Franklin Roosevelt had an affair in the 1910s, and Eleanor Roosevelt had to decide whether to leave him or not. And she decided to stick around. And part of it was for the sake of the children, but I think part of it also might have been a recognition that he was going places in politics, and he could take her along. She had a political agenda of her own. She had ideas of how America might be improved.
At age 39, Franklin was struck down by polio. He would never walk again. But thanks to Eleanor's steely determination and unfailing support, his political rise continued. With FDR elected president, the country soon learned it had a new kind of first lady.
The president's wife taking her exercise astride a horse. It's been a long time since Washington has seen a sight like this, and it looks good.
When World War I veterans had marched on Washington to demand their bonuses, President Hoover sent the Army to disperse them. When the vets returned a year later, FDR sent Eleanor.
They received free quarters, an Army chow at nearby Fort Hunt, and a surprise visit from the First Lady. Mrs. Roosevelt waded through acres of mud to inquire after their welfare, one of many such missions that made her name a byword.
Eleanor played an essential role during the Great Depression, and she was constantly traveling. She traveled all over the country, going to visit people who were in deep poverty and in great need. Now, at the same time, Eleanor was coming back to Washington, and she was telling Franklin, you have to do more. You have to do more.
She comes from a pretty patrician world. and she is comfortable enough to go out and see the sharecropper in the field. And not just go see the miner, but to actually go down into the mine.
Americans knew Eleanor was on their side. She made sure every single letter sent to her was answered by someone in the federal government. She traveled the country tirelessly and fearlessly, becoming the first First Lady to fly.
Very glad to have this opportunity.
And earning the nickname Eleanor Everywhere. When need be, she could hang out with the elites too.
The White House is again the scene of a birthday celebration for the president. At midnight, Mrs. Roosevelt cuts the giant cake, a big slice to actor George Murphy, a little one for little Margaret O'Brien. Joe E. Brown looks hungry, too. The First Lady, in the president's absence, gives his message.
Whatever we can contribute to promote our children's health is an investment in our country's future. It is an assertion of our American birthright to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Eleanor was the president's conscience. She would invite friends to the White House and seat them next to Franklin, the better to bend his ear on behalf of a favorite cause. She held press conferences, open only to women, forcing the major news services to hire their first female reporters. Her White House was like a busy summer camp, with a constant flow of family, friends, and colleagues occupying the upstairs bedrooms. At a time when lynchings were still common in the South, and blacks were second-class citizens everywhere, Eleanor fought for civil rights.
They had kind of this tag team relationship, Eleanor and Franklin. Eleanor would go out there and she would speak in favor of civil rights reform, an anti-lynching law, and she would say, "My husband is with us in his heart, but practical politics prevents him from coming along just yet." And Franklin Roosevelt, when speaking to those conservatives, would sort of throw up his hands and say, the missus, what can you do about her? So they were able to have it both ways, and they became a very effective team.
In 1939, the Daughters of the American Revolution refused permission for singer Marian Anderson to perform before an integrated audience at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. Eleanor promptly resigned from the DAR in protest and moved the concert to the Lincoln Memorial.
It happened. 75,000 people around, in front of the Lincoln Memorial and around the reflecting pool, and Marian Anderson singing. It was an extraordinary occasion to see this magnificent opera singer before a huge crowd, black and white, old and young, from all walks of life.
He's got the whole world in his
There'd really been nothing quite like it that had ever happened in the United States before, and it really marked a watershed in American civil rights, and really led to a future in which Martin Luther King could stand in front of the Lincoln Memorial and speak about his dream.
Eleanor began her public life as a stand-in for her husband, but soon learned that people wanted to hear from her.
She wrote newspaper columns for decades. I mean, this begins back in the 30s. She will write 8,000 newspaper columns in her life. This is where battling your shyness to the mat had to take place, or she can't play out these public roles the way that she did. She's always in the public eye. She's always giving speeches. She's always writing. She's projecting herself in so many different ways.
When the Japanese struck at Pearl Harbor, Eleanor spoke to the nation within hours, a day before FDR addressed Congress.
Many of you all over this country have boys in the services who will now be called upon to go into action. You cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape a clutch of fear at your heart. And yet I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears. Whatever is asked of us, I am sure we can accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America.
Eleanor Roosevelt would become the most famous and significant female voice really in the world. During the war itself, she gave radio addresses, she had her own column, and she was a voice of conscience. She was a voice of morality.
In 1941, Eleanor grabbed a chance to boost the war effort and promote civil rights.
Cadets of the Army Air Corps' first all-black fighter unit are taught and trained at Tuskegee.
Alabama's Tuskegee Institute housed the all-black 99th Fighter Squadron. The unit was an experiment. Many Americans believed that blacks could never be pilots. Eleanor knew better and eagerly boarded a plane flown by Charles Anderson, AKA Chief Anderson.
Despite the Secret Service telling Eleanor not to go up, she flew with him. She flew for more than an hour over the Alabama countryside and came back down to earth, and suddenly the idea that African Americans could be pilots made sense.
At times, Americans grew weary under the burdens of total war. 4 long years of dashed hopes and lost lives. Throughout, Eleanor played a pivotal role in boosting morale.
It was an earnest and hard-working First Lady who visited our boys in the Southwest Pacific, as these pictures just released by the Marine Corps disclose. Informality is the keynote of Mrs. Roosevelt's chats with these wounded boys.
In a nation such as ours, every man who fights for us is in some way our man.
Eleanor would live for 17 years past Franklin. America's first delegate to the United Nations, she became a tireless voice for the voiceless, the driving force behind the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
She often carried her own bag through railroad stations or airports. For her, the cause was everything.
The awkward, painfully shy girl had done more than conquer her fears. In the words of President Truman, she had become First Lady of the World.